Okay, in this video, we're going to take a look at Daniel chapter 4. This is Nebuchadnezzar's second dream. We'll call it here the tree dream. So I'm not going to read the passage itself. I'll leave that to you to do, and then just make some highlights and comments here about aspects of this dream. So we'll begin here by, first of all, noticing that though it's in the form of a royal encyclica, it's really meant for all who live on earth. So not just those who are in the king's kingdom. The doxology that we have here in this repeat the words great, mighty, kingdom, sovereignty, and this repetition of words all point to Daniel's God as the Most High God. This is an expression that was used in Daniel chapter 3 as well. So a God who is above other gods. The king describes himself, interestingly enough, like a tree in verse 4, that he was prospering in his palace. And so that's what a tree does. A tree prospers. And so in this way, before he even begins to have this dream of a tree, kind of stands for him, but he describes himself this way. Though Daniel has succeeded before, he is still not consulted until the others have failed. So there seems to be a little bit of a tension here between this account and what we have already seen about Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar's court earlier on in Daniel. So Daniel was able to tell the king his dream and its interpretation. Why is it that Daniel isn't consulted first when Nebuchadnezzar has this dream? But once again, it demonstrates that Daniel is going to supersede, surpass the abilities of the Chaldean magicians and sorcerers and prophets and interpreters. So Daniel is noted to be endowed with a spirit, but is it of the holy gods, or is it that of God? So in verse 8, at last Daniel came and for me, he was named Belshazzar, after the name of my God, and who is endowed with the spirit of the holy gods. So this is, or it may be kind of a holy divine spirit, maybe is what the Aramaic here is supposed to express. So he's endowed with this a spirit to interpret dreams, interpret visions. So it's not quite clear what exactly is supposed to be stated here by this description of Daniel's name. Then 10 through 14, we get this remarkable tree. This is what Nebuchadnezzar is going to see. So this is a mythological tree that's going to connect the heavens. Notice the plural there. So there are different levels of heavens or different realms of heavens and the earth. It is a tree that provides food for all and a place to rest for the birds. That's kind of interesting, this idea of the resting of the birds. Birds oftentimes can be symbols for different groups of people, different nations. And so this idea of a tree providing it for, lots of different kinds of people. The birds in the air nested in its branches. The language is a little bit somewhat similar to what we hear in the parable of Jesus about a mustard seed becoming a tree, and in its branches are the different birds that nest in it. The tree is to be cut down, verses 13 through 18. So the tree's destruction is announced by a holy watcher. So these ideas of a watcher, you might want to consult, take a look at 1 Enoch chapter 1, verse 5, who also talks about watchers. These watchers are these kind of spiritual beings that are associated with the story of the sons of God in the book of Genesis, chapter 6, who, cohabitate with the daughters of men. And so here we have a holy watcher who announces this destruction. So does the act of watching then kind of imply God's attention to evil in the world? And so things that are happening, especially with arrogant rulers, they need to know, they need to be reminded, though they may be acting in arrogance and defiance to God's sovereignty, God is nevertheless watching. He has his servants who watches, as it were, what all rulers, all kings, all powers are doing. Now, it's not quite clear who actually is being instructed in verse 13 to cut down the tree and chop off its branches. So who is it that is supposed to do it? It's kind of like a divine decree. This is something that is going to happen, but nobody particularly is instructed to do it. How much of the tree is going to be left? I point you to the commentary that I'm asking the class to read from Seow, his commentary on Daniel, just to kind of see that we're seeing a portion of it. And so this idea of a portion of a tree being left, this idea of a stump being down, how much is a stump? This shows God's, as it were, mercy, not to completely eradicate a nation or an empire, but will do partial destructions. And we're also going to see partial destructions when we look at the book of Revelation. When judgment starts coming out, there's going to be partial judgments upon the earth, upon peoples. So something of this is going to be left. And we get as well this idea of a tethered person who is going to be left, and this tethered person is going to have a mind of an animal to show to all who live that God is sovereign. So what is going to end up happening here is this state, this mental state of Nebuchadnezzar is supposed to indicate that although he was arrogant and pushed himself, forward, God is going to humble him. He's going to lower him. He's going to bring him into a state, and that state then is indicative. Is supposed to be indicative of God's sovereignty over kings. Then we get in verses 19 through 27 is going to be the interpretation of the dream. So again, why is Daniel's Chaldean name Belshazzar in verse 19 then used? The king Belshazzar, do not let the dream or the interpretation terrify you. So his thoughts here terrified him. So the Daniel, who was called Belshazzar. So once again, repeating the name, making sure that this foreign name for Daniel is used. The author never wants readers to forget that Daniel has been receiving this foreign name. There seems to be something going on with the author about this use of this name to describe his place. And again, it may be that these are part of earlier traditions in which the name Belshazzar was used, but it's indicating this was Daniel. So it's just a curious thing to keep seeing this emphasis on his name. The king is the tree, as interpreted. So in the Bible, arboreal metaphors, in other words, those metaphors that have to do with plants, for humans signify their dependency upon God for survival. And it's interesting. Well, not only are kings or human beings emphasized as kings, but also peoples. Israel is a plant. Israel is a vineyard, and describe Israel as a vineyard, and that God is the vineyard keeper. God's a farmer, and God takes care of his people. So this idea of people being like trees and therefore needing someone to care for it. The certainty of the dream's fulfillment rests in that it is the Most High's decree. This is what God has decreed, so therefore it will come about. So the king is going to learn then from what's going to happen to him that God is sovereign. So announcing what's going to happen to his kingdom, what's going to happen to him, is indicating that sovereignty. So an interesting question that this section raises for us then is, how do the Gentiles either atone or break off for sin? So Nebuchadnezzar is the one who is sinning here in his arrogance, and he's going to atone for his sins by this experience that he's going to undergo. And while he goes through that experience, basically going wild or going mad, having the mind of an animal, there is going to be a limitation on what's going to take place. So the judgment against Nebuchadnezzar is both going to demonstrate justice, that God holds accountable rulers and emperors for arrogance, and mercy, and that they are not, eliminated or ruled off from the planet. They don't end up dying. So once again, to demonstrate rulers are dependent upon God's providential care of them. So one atones, a Gentile atones, as it were, for sins by experiencing suffering. So then you get to how the dream is fulfilled in verses 28 through 33. So there does seem to be a tension between verse 28 and 29 as to when the kingdom departs from the king. So all this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar, verse 28. At the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. So between 28 and 29, what happens? When all this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar, does that mean that it happens that after it's revealed what the dream means, it occurred to him? Or, as verse 29 seems to indicate, it was after 12 months that this came about. And verse 28 is just acting as a foretelling how it takes place. So was it immediate, or was it a year later? So there is a biblical theme here of arrogance, then, in the form of equating oneself with God. Certainly this is what happens with Adam and Eve, where they try to be like God. They take the fruit in order to have the knowledge of good and evil, or not recognizing God's sovereignty. So, which is certainly the case with Judah's exile, because Judah's kings did not recognize that God is sovereign and can protect Judah. But instead, what the kings do, kings of Judah, they make political alliances, which God does not want them to make. And they do so because out of fear that they are going to be taken over. So rather than trusting God is sovereign and can care for them, they make these political alliances that God doesn't want made, and therefore are judged, held responsible, and then thrown into exile, or leads into banishment. So where Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden, Judah is cast out of the land. Here we're going to see that the king himself, because of what happens to him, is going to experience something of akin to an exile. He's going to be kind of driven, as it were, away. The kingdom has departs from him, and he is driven away from human society. So in verse 32, so this idea of being driven. So exile is a part of the divine punishment for arrogance. But the king is going to learn, and he is going to end up being restored back to his kingdom. So after the king lifts up his eyes to heaven, his reason and knowledge is going to return to him. So it's this recognition of God and God's sovereignty and place authority over all peoples, and recognizing that, then reason, knowledge comes back. Wisdom, we might say. So what the author is stressing is that the recognition of God as sovereign over all creation is the appropriate response of humans, particularly human rulers, especially those who serve as figures of authority over others. God is supposed to place. So all of that then is kind of this essence for the Daniel 4. Not only is Nebuchadnezzar restored to his kingdom, but still more greatness was added to him because he lifted his eyes to heavens. Once again, because he recognizes God's way is truth and justice. So God will hold kings accountable. Now, I don't know if at the time that Daniel was composed or written, in the 2nd century BC, I doubt that the author of Daniel expects Antiochus Epiphanes, who is the big threat, to have to lift his eyes up to heaven. I think he anticipates that Antiochus is not learning the lessons from these other rulers whom God has shown mercy to. You don't have to be a Israelite or Jewish king in order to prosper over God's people. God can use non-Israelite, non-Jewish kings to provide prosperity for his people. But if those rulers fail to recognize God's sovereignty, act arrogantly, try to get God's people to abandon their faith in him, then he's going to hold those kings responsible. And as in the case of Antiochus Epiphanes, as we will see later on in Daniel, he'll end up being killed. So those who raise themselves up to contend with God by contending with God's people will ultimately come to ruin, or will have to experience some kind of divine punishment until they learn the lesson. So I think that takes us then through Daniel chapter 4 and some of the key points that I wanted you to observe about that chapter.